Hey,
Hello. Michael, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can. Christopher, I think you might be on mute.
Of course I am.
Oh man,
Good
There we
morning.
are.
I didn't get my
Hello,
theme song. I
all.
didn't get my theme song yet.
Oh, but we have this. We could just do this whenever you come
That's our outro. That's our outro.
on. That's true.
That's our
I'm
intro.
jumping the gun on
Shoot,
us.
shoot.
Yay. Well, good morning. And what a happy morning.
Yeah.
And we usually have this special session on our first Sunday of the month. But hey, what's life without a little difference and change? So
Yeah.
here we are with Ask a Theologian. And our
That's right.
theologian happens to be Michael Delashmet.
Hey,
Was that a slow motion? Ole ole? What was that?
ole, ole.
It was a delay, Ole.
Oh.
Oh, boom, boom.
So for those of you who have not seen this segment and are joining us for the first time, Michael Delashmet is our famous in-house theologian who answers all of our burning questions. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, feel free to just put those right in the chat, and Christopher and I will be sort of monitoring the chat, and we will ask them to Michael as they come up. We don't have any yet, so we can either chit chat or
Chat a
Christopher, if you
theologian.
I
have
have
a,
a
oh, here we
oh,
go. It's going to be a
I
good
have a
one.
question.
Sure.
So it's been such a trying time this year, so much loss. And what would you say to those who are grieving or in the process of grieving or have grieved for a year? What would you say? What would you say to those who are in their various stages of grieving?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and it's certainly appropriate. Given that we've been in the middle of this just crazy year of one trauma after the next, and there's this theme that Lutheran theologians use, that they look at the Bible through what they call the theology of the cross. And the theology of the cross, it was a phrase that Martin Luther in the 16th century I guess we could say, popularized or used. He said, a theologian of the cross calls a thing what it is. And that it's a way of saying that in the cross of Christ, God's love for humanity and the totality of the wickedness of the world are met together, and that God's not a stranger to our pain, our suffering, the hurt in life, that God is in those moments of pain. Where we least expect to see God, that's where God is. And I think it's a temptation to take the other side, which Luther called a theology of glory, which just tries to minimize pain and suffering, or to say, well, pain and suffering, you must have done something wrong. It's like the person who came to it's when Jesus healed the man born blind, and he was asked by a bystander, who sinned that this man is born blind, he or his parents. And Jesus is like, that's not how this thing works. He was born blind so that the glory of God would be revealed. It's not that human suffering is the way that God chooses to reveal God's glory or God's power or God's love, but that's a place where we know that God shows God's glory, God's power, and God's love for us. So I guess I would say, if you're in the midst of suffering and loss, like almost all of us are, or this kind of ongoing trauma, we can be assured that God is with us in that. God doesn't promise us a smooth road or a life without pain and suffering. God promises to be with us in the middle of pain and suffering.
Okay, that's a good
Thank
one.
you. That's a good
Yeah.
response. Thank
Hyatt
you.
does have a question for us. It is a very interesting question. In the Old Testament, there's a wild story involving Elisha cursing a group of youth for taunting him. The youth are devoured by bears. Moral of the story: respect your elders.
Man, I had to bring up that one, didn't you, Hyatt? Yeah. So the Bible is full of really, really weird stories. There's just like no two ways about it. And when we read these things, we have to ask ourselves, are they, are they here as a source of like allegory? Are they here to tell us a lesson, or are they just kind of included, for kind of, bringing a bit of like light to the story? Do they have like a narrative purpose? So we have to always kind of ask ourselves, what's going on. And it's really easy when you read a story like that to think, well, this is a parable about not taunting your elders or not respecting your elders. But I would take that within the scope of like what's the Bible trying to say as a whole? Is the Bible as a whole telling us to stay in our place and or bears are going to eat us? Or is the Bible as a whole telling us the story of God's creating, redeeming, and sustaining love for the universe? And I think it's the second piece, that it's this story of God's love. And sometimes as that story of God's love is told, there are weird things that show up that do not reflect the love of God. And maybe the people who wrote those stories down were, had an original meaning or original purpose behind there that we don't know. Or maybe the story shows us that's even people that God chooses to work through, like mighty prophet Elisha, are broken and do terrible things like we do. I mean, that's one of the most amazing things to me about the Bible, is that the characters that are usually like the high points of the story, like Abraham and David and Solomon and Elisha, are broken and in ways that they would be canceled right now if this was the 21st century. Abraham, as we're studying on the Thursday night Bible study, Abraham like tells his wife Sarai to go sleep with the Pharaoh so that Abraham can get like some donkeys and some camels and some oxen. Like he sells his wife to Pharaoh, right? And then he becomes the father of all nations. It's crazy. So the point isn't let's follow these people. Let's be like Abraham or like Elisha and curse some people so some kids get eaten by bears. But rather the point is, even broken people can be used for the purposes of God, which is really good, because I don't know about you, but I am a broken person. Now, I haven't cursed any youth lately and had them eaten by bears, but I've certainly, I live in New York. I've said some things that I regret on the street, but God is still, I hope, at work in my life.
Barbara Jones has asked for a last prayer for my family and yours. Yet Aaron Lee asks this question: if Jesus was baptized as an adult, why do we baptize babies?
That is a great question. So, the baptism of Jesus is definitely a model for Christian baptism. And the reason why Christians baptize is because the baptism and the Lord's Supper are the two sacraments that were instituted by Jesus. Those are the things that he told his disciples to do. So at the Last Supper, he told his disciples to repeat this Last Supper. And then as he's leaving in Matthew, at the end of Matthew, he tells his disciples to make disciples and to baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So baptizing and communion become these two kind of foundational practices that Christians take with them as they kind of go out and follow in the way of Jesus in the early days of following Jesus. And one of the kind of like the mark of a person who decides to follow Jesus is that they are baptized. We think about, say, the story of the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts, who is in the middle of the desert, and a disciple whose name I cannot remember for the life of me appears to him, and he asks to be baptized, and is baptized right there and begins following Jesus. We also hear in these early stories of people deciding to follow Jesus through baptism that it wasn't just the individual, but it was also their household that was baptized. And the household included all people. It included their indentured servants. It included children. It included everyone involved in a household. So very quickly for Christians, baptism, was an initiation into the faith for new believers, but it was also a way that people who were part of the faith included into this new way of following Jesus, their whole family. And so, Christians, many different traditions do infant baptism and also only adult baptism or believers baptism. But the reason why we baptize children is because it's a mark that this entire family is going to be engaged in following in the way of Jesus. So, and some people say, well, how can a child choose to be baptized? I mean, isn't baptism something that I have to make a personal choice on? And that's certainly a good argument. But I would say, can we ever really fully understand what God's up to in God's grace? Can an adult ever fully understand what salvation means or what baptism means? Both baptism and the Eucharist are these like really kind of dense points where God's grace is known to us in physical things like water and wine and bread. And there's a mystery deep inside of that no one can fully understand, whether they're a child or an adult.
I have a follow-up question. And the disciple, as Amy has shared with us, was Philip. Is that right?
Wow, man.
Yeah.
I got sidelined with the Elisha question and the bears. So that's all I could think. Elisha and the bears.
Well, you've been saved. You can go in peace.
Thank you, Amy.
Now. There in the Episcopal faith, is there a process or how do I say? If you're baptized as a baby or child, being baptized as an adult, like, is that a part of the Episcopal faith? Like, is it required or is it encouraged? Or
that's a great question. So Episcopalians, we confess this creed that we believe in one baptism for the forgiveness of sins. That's part of the Nicene Creed. And so we believe that once a person is baptized, they're baptized, and there's no need to baptize them again. You don't lose your baptism. The promise that God makes to you in baptism is indissoluble. It can't be washed away. It's something you have been adopted into God's family, and God's never, ever, ever going to let you go. And that is really hard to get our minds around, because we think, well, what if a baptized person decides to renounce their vows and to no longer be a Christian and no longer follow in the way of Jesus? Guess what? God doesn't renounce God's vows. It's a covenant that God is making with you in saying, I've got you. You are part of my family forever, and there's nothing that can be done of it. And that's the power of God's word that appears to us in baptism.
wow.
But there are a couple of instances where you might need to be what's called provisionally baptized, and then we'll talk about confirmation. So when I was going through the ordination process years and years ago, first in the Church of England, I couldn't find my baptism certificate, so which I needed as like paperwork to lodge with the diocese before I could be go through the process. And so I had to be provisionally baptized, which wasn't re-baptized, but the bishop was like, hey, in case you haven't been baptized, I baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, so that I could have a piece of paper. Now that's a really bad reason for rebaptism. And instead of, and it wasn't rebaptism, it was provisional baptism, because I couldn't prove that I had been baptized. But we reaffirm our baptisms all the time. Whenever we see someone baptized, it's an opportunity for us to reaffirm our own baptisms. Whenever we say the Apostles' Creed in morning or evening prayer instead of the Nicene Creed, that reminds us of our baptism, because the Apostles' Creed, as opposed to the Nicene Creed, is the creed that Christians have almost always said at baptisms. It's a particular form of the creed that kind of reminds us of these promises that were made for us. And then finally, we can reaffirm our baptism in a more like formal liturgical way through the rite of confirmation, and confirmation has become this sort of sacrament like liturgy that Christians go through after they've been baptized, oftentimes as an adolescent or in their 20s or 30s or whenever. And it's a way of saying, this baptismal promise that was made for me, likely this is something that I want to publicly affirm for myself, and I want the church to confirm as well that I am choosing to be a follower of Jesus. So rather than rebaptizing, we would pursue confirmation, which is a great, and it's also in our tradition something that involves a bishop. The bishop visits the church and a person is confirmed. And the reason why the bishop confirms you as opposed to your local priest or your pastor is because, again, it's a symbol of the whole church. The bishop is like the symbol of the whole church welcoming you into this community.
Denise was also in the chat talking about the confirmation piece. So
Cool.
yeah, so you got back up there.
You got confirmation on confirmation.
Oh, double confirmation.
Bam.
And Elisha was just saying Jesus's take on baptism is I got you. So,
yeah.
Hashtag make it plain.
But Mitch did have a question for you, which is, what, if anything, has changed in your thinking or understanding of God or Christianity or the Bible in this past year?
Wow, in this past year. Wow. Yeah, I think, it's the thing that I probably have been thinking the most about is how technology connects us to one another in ways that are really authentic. And what I mean by this is that Episcopalians have this really high view and a very particular interpretation of incarnation. Incarnation is this belief that in Jesus Christ, God has become flesh, and that God really cares about the material world and physical things, and so it's important for us to be in places where we can gather together in person, and we can consume bread and wine and feel water on our bodies and in our bodies, and that there's this very kind of like embodied sense of what it means to worship and be involved in community. And you think about like how incense appeals to the senses, and tapestries and vestments kind of appeal to the eye, and it's all a very like embodied kind of physical kind of faith. It's not, very few Episcopal churches are like whitewashed without kind of stained glass and very, very simplified. Almost all of them have some sort of kind of connection to a very embodied faith, even if it's just the embodiment of worship in the Book of Common Prayer. And then the pandemic hits, and we can't meet, and we can't touch, and we can't sing, and we can't eat bread, and we can't drink wine, and we can't feel water. What does that mean? Are we disconnected? But I think what we find is that technology, which we viewed at one point as being like this, creating this virtual space that we're like disembodied. You think of like the Lawnmower Man in 1980s, 1990s, kind of like cyberpunk style films, Max Headroom and these kind of like disembodied virtual reality spaces. That's actually not at all what's going on. That this technology has created another way for us to be embodied and related to each other. That we're not disconnected. We're actually deeply connected. And what does this technology teach us about what it means to be part of this mystical body of Christ? And how does this experience of me being in my office in Chelsea and you all being in the various places that you are, how does this like relate to what it means for us to be connected to one another across time and space, and for me to be connected with Jesus? And I think it's just really, I think for me, deepened what it means to be incarnate and embodied and connected to God and to others. And that's probably the thing that the pandemic has taught me the most.
Wow. So you don't have any like technology Zoom fatigue?
Oh, I'm so tired of it. But I'm also an introvert, and so I get like people fatigue. So for me, this is just another form of people fatigue. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we don't have any other questions, but I did want to just make an observation. And Christopher, it's a question for you, kind of. It's not a theological question, don't worry.
Oh.
Were you asking that question about grief because of Rachel's sermon?
No, but like a lot of things, nothing is in isolation, I guess.
Oh, I was just because I think one of the things that she was talking about, which it had never occurred to me, was when she was talking about, Jesus in the resurrection still carried his scars with him. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that was something that was it was just kind of mind blowing for me to think about that, because I think when I think about resurrection, I think about, coming out on the other side, all of this is healed, it's done. Like, all of those things that you've gone through, all of the grief, all of that stuff, like you come out shiny and new.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's always what I've thought. And so, Michael, this would be more of the question for you is, theologically, like, where did I get that idea? Because, if we're talking it, with what Rachel was saying today in the sermon, which I think is really powerful and speaks to me on a much deeper level than, like, look, once you're resurrected in whatever, form that is, in whatever thing you need to let die and get reborn, like, it's not just this clean slate kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of us who grew up in kind of North American evangelical Christianity inherited this view that like, that everything's made clean and made perfect, and that as a way of like covering over, like almost like the greatest emotional invalidation of the universe. Like all the things that you brought to Hugh right now are somehow gone, and the only thing that God cares about is this new thing, because the old thing was so rotten and terrible anyway. But that's not at all the story of the gospel or the story of the Bible. Again, it goes back to these like jerks in the Old Testament, like Elisha and Abraham and David, who that part is still told. I mean, think about that. Their stories, their bad biographies were never whitewashed. We get the whole picture there. God sees the whole you and still chooses to love you and take that and walk with you as a healed and whole person who still carries those scars and that baggage and that kind of past history. So God's not asking us to dump our past history or forget who we were, but rather see how God has been with us even at points when we didn't think that God was with us, and is going to continue to be with us. That hashtag Jesus got you in baptism. But I think, yeah, I mean, it's a temptation to just focus on like the goal and not recognize that life is this really huge process that we're still like very much in. And one of the problems with that view of like, our resurrected selves or our new life selves are going to be completely completely like whole, it really challenges our theology of disability. Like what is it, if I don't see 3D because my eyes don't work right and my brain's miswired. And so I can't catch, and my eyes go like weird when I'm thinking, and that's like who I am. And I can't, and if I were to see 3D, I don't even know if I'd know how to navigate the world anymore. And so, if God's like, if God doesn't take my broken eyes and like bring me to heaven in my brokenness, and I don't know if I'd even know who I am anymore. And similarly, a lot of people in the blind or the deaf community struggle a lot with our kind of insistence on seeing or hearing being absolutely normative. And they'd say, you know what, I don't really want to hear. That isn't, I wouldn't know what that means. And so I think God's grace is big enough to encompass what where we're at and what we need.
Yeah. That's really beautiful.
Totally
Yeah, that's really
beautiful.
well said. Because I think for me, there's also like seduction in the idea that like the hard things that you've gone through or the things that have scarred you will go away.
Yeah.
And, but that is a part of exactly what you were saying. It's a part of your story. It's a part of what made you who you are and made you beautiful. So yeah, I appreciate that. I think this is now just going to become a tradition that every time we do Ask a Theologian, you say something that makes me cry.
That means it's working.
Yeah.
I mean, Ask a Theologian has become something I look forward to. I guess both for the edification, but also just the sheer art of seeing someone like apply their wisdom and knowledge in such a very concise and very meaningful way as you do. So it's a really beautiful thing to see and participate in. Amy responded to a part of your speech, the covering over, as if it's saying all that you went through no longer counts. And Jinli is impressed with the greatest emotional invalidation, that part of what you said. That thank you for putting a sensation into words for me. And Alicia thinks you're beautiful, Martha, which I totally wholeheartedly agree with that in your big open heart. Melissa, some are challenged by the resurrection and see it more as being symbolic.
Yeah.
Why is it an important part of our faith and belief? In 3 minutes.
Totally do that in 3 minutes. So,
that question's a breeze. Let me take that one. No.
so I hear you. And, for the last several hundred years, as sort of the Western Europe has, or the kind of European Eurocentric cultures have really struggled with kind of imagining an interventionist God. The notion of the resurrection has been really, really hard, and it became, mythologized. And so theologians from the 17th century on have wrestled with, could this really happen, since it seems so different from anything we know about history. We don't really see people raised from the dead, and if empirical observation is the foundation of what we know to be true about the world, then it really puts in question things like miracles or the resurrection. I believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. I really do. And I believe it in part because really, really smart people who I trust believe it. And then I also believe it because I think about how could the Jesus story have caught on in the way that it did, had there not been some kind of continuation of Jesus's life after the resurrection, and the way that these accounts are written, the way that people's lives were changed, and the way that Jesus continues to appear to people throughout the story of Scripture, and how Jesus continues to appear to us in different but yet still transforming and powerful ways. And I also think that if we're going to believe in a God who creates the world and can send God's Son into the world and can redeem the world, and a God worth putting our hope in for the future of our own lives and the future of the world around us, that God can certainly raise their Son from the dead. And it's not, even though it may not be something that I can see with my eyes, or I'm not like Thomas and can touch his wounds, I can believe that this God who I pray to, and I pray answers and responds to prayer and engages with me, is the same God who can also raise Jesus from the dead. So it is definitely a leap of faith, but I don't think it's a leap into nonsense.
That was very good.
Well said.
As usual. And you made it in time.
Yes, I knew. I had my eye on the clock. I was like, oh, I got to do this.
Oh, wow. Sorry if it was a timed answer, but you were so brilliant. Here we are, another fabulous Ask a Theologian session, and another inspiring leap into the week ahead. So, Michael Delashmet, thank you.
Thank you. Friends. This is great
for being with us.
Yeah.
Yes. We always love talking to you.
Yeah, I love it too.
Look forward to it. Martha, big hug to you. Michael, big hug to you.
Big hugs.
Yes.
And big hug to everyone.
Big hugs out there
in Viewland. Ole, 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 ole.
Ole, ole. Bye. Have a good week.